if marketing is the storyteller of society nowadays, it becomes a kind of social ontology. It means that if everybody wants to sell something, if everybody wants to put something into marketing, I believe that we might be a hostage in, for example, in terms of education.
Existe uma prática cada vez mais comum de grupos de pressão utilizarem as redes para pautar a opinião pública. Quando as empresas e indivíduos não se comportam da maneira com a qual a patrulha ideológica deseja, inicia um processo de caça às bruxas, que vai muito além de apenas manifestar uma opinião contrária. São expostos familiares, amigos, pessoas próximas. Pressiona-se por demissões, boicotes e cancelamento de contratos. Endereços de moradia e dados pessoais são revelados, entre muitos outros. Ainda contamos com a nossa liberdade de expressão ou estamos virando reféns de milícias digitais? Para debater o tema, convidamos Luiz Felipe Pondé, filósofo e escritor, Jason Brennan, cientista político, e Frank Furedi, sociólogo. Também teremos 2 palestrantes internacionais. Por isso, o mesmo será conduzido em inglês com legendas em português.
I would answer this question if we are maybe hostage to social militia and social media at this first moment. I would answer yes. It doesn't mean that I don't believe we may cope with things. We don't have certain tools that may use, or that our, let's say, freedom of speech is completely finished. No, but I would like to stress 2 very basic points, which I think, 2 topics which I think are very important. The first one, I would say, social media is, of course, digital marketing. And being digital marketing, it means that it influences, it's not a coincidence that we use this word influencer, influenciador here in Brazil, right? Social media being marketing, it influences behavior deeply towards a certain ethics of sales all the time. I mean, nowadays we may even sell our pizza or the hotel we go on vacation. So I think that if marketing is the storyteller of society nowadays, it becomes a kind of social ontology. It means that if everybody wants to sell something, if everybody wants to put something into marketing, I believe that we might be a hostage in, for example, in terms of education. Even universities nowadays, if you take, for example, teachers or professors, many times we are only one piece in a chain of sales, to sell the school, to sell certain ideas, to sell certain business. I see that as a certain, let's say, a certain situation where we are hostage.
In a way, I think the question is, as was just answered, the answer is yes. So what I wanted to do is focus on explaining why people behave the way they do on politics. Why is it we behave so badly online? And I think here we have to start by thinking about political behavior in general. So what political scientists and others have basically found over the past 70 years of research is that for most people, when they're participating in politics, when they're joining political parties, when they subscribe to ideologies or put their names down next to them, they're not really interested in policy. Politics is not about policy for most people. Politics is really about fitting in. People wear political ideas the way that they wear Nike sneakers or the way that they wear diesel dungarees. It's really about fitting in with the group. It's about expressing that you're a loyal member of a particular group. Maybe the best way of analogizing it would be to say that it's somewhat like sports fandom. I'm from the New England area of the United States, and so I'm a fan of all of the New England sports teams. I like the Boston Red Sox and the New England Patriots and the Boston Celtics and so on. And in order to fit in with other people in my group, wearing clothing that displays their team insignia and rooting for the team loudly and holding stupid and irrational beliefs about them even are a way of proving that I'm a loyal member of that group. I'm going to root for them come what may, no matter what. And when one of them is accused of doing something bad, I won't believe it, and so on. In a way, a lot of what politics is doing with us today is what religion used to do for us. From a sociological perspective, religion has the function of binding people together. And in order to do that, what you need to have in a religion are some sort of mix of expensive rituals and expensive beliefs. Do things that are difficult to do. Show up at a certain time, refuse to eat certain foods, cut off certain parts of your body, or believe certain things which are not readily apparent and thus might seem absurd. And it works. When people do these things, especially when they believe weird things, it proves to other people in your group that you are a loyal member of that group. It makes people work together more. They trust one another more. Though unfortunately, what most religions have is, even as they increase the amount of amity within a group, the amount of trust within a group, they decrease the trust among groups and increase the amount of enmity towards other groups. And this brings us to the primary thing that's going on in social media today, which is something we might call moral grandstanding. I'm not really sure if there's a good translation of that in Portuguese. I'm guessing it's something like arrogancia, and I don't know how you pronounce that. I'm doing the Spanish translation, sorry. But moral grandstanding is the idea of using moral language to sort of promote your own status and your own power. You use moral language not to judge, but to show that you are pure and good. And one of the unfortunate things about moral grandstanding is that it leads to a kind of virtue of intolerance. You know, after all, imagine like my neighbor across the street happens to be a Nazi, and I say, I'm fine with that. I'm still going to be friends with him. You would rightly react by saying, what, you're going to put up with his Nazism, his advocacy of evil and injustice because you like the same beer and watch the same sports and he's fun to play basketball with? That's absurd. You're a horrible person. And so you get sort of proof that you're morally good by tolerating less and less. The less that I'm willing to tolerate, the more it means I must really be committed to justice and really committed to the good. You can tolerate all sorts of things because you don't care about the good and the just so much, but I can tolerate hardly anything because I'm so committed to morality. Taking that stand in a public space, whether you're a corporation, you're a professor, you're a journalist, you're a YouTuber, whatever you might be, proves to other people that you are high status. It gets you power, it gets you resources, and that's what's going on. So it's leading to a culture where we have a strong personal incentive to exaggerate our moral differences and to engage in censorship against one another. Unfortunately, the internet is sort of owned by one side versus the other, and this leads to increased polarization and increased social censorship. That's the mechanism underlying it, and I don't really know how to fix it. But thank you.
I take a very different view to Jason and also to Luis Felipe, in the sense that I have very little problem with the social media. I think there are some horrible things that are going on there, some very corrosive dialogue, a kind of powerful imperative and impulse towards censorship. And as people have suggested, a very sort of palpable sense of virtue signaling, which has a very destructive effect. But I think that the problem that we're discussing is principally an offline problem. I think that in many respects, the problem for me is not the irrationality or the chaotic behavior of the mobs. I have a much higher opinion of the people than that. I think on balance, there's no reason why in certain circumstances, those situations cannot be changed. But what I do worry about is that there has been an intense level of polarization, particularly in Anglo-American society, where people are encouraged not to talk to each other. They're continually sort of encouraged to talk to people who are just like themselves. And when you have that kind of polarized environment, then tolerance becomes just another word. And intolerance becomes the practice that's promoted all the time. And I think what's particularly worrying for me is that the problem is not with ordinary people, as I understand it. It's not with the illiterate mobs and the masses. I think the problem comes from the fact that, particularly in the American, but also to a lesser extent in my own country here in Britain, our cultural elites have been complicit in continually encouraging a climate of intolerance towards freedom of expression. They've continually promoted a form of identity politics, which has a tendency of making politics personal. I agree with Jason on that point. The personalization of politics is in many ways lethal, because the minute that the personal becomes political, it basically means that when I criticize one of you guys, you know, I'm not just making an intellectual criticism, I'm attacking your persona. It actually means that criticism is perceived as the annihilation of your very existence. And I think that kind of sensibility I've noticed every time I go to the United States, where people tell me that what I'm saying is offensive and traumatic, you know, it's psychologically damaging, and therefore I had better shut up, because otherwise I'm not behaving in a right kind of proper sort of way. So it seems to me that what we've got is a situation where, you know, very often the signals towards this kind of polarized politics, this kind of mob mentality, are actually coming from above. I think it's very sad to me that the universities are probably the most intolerant terrain, sort of space at the moment in both of our societies in the Anglo-American world. It's in the universities that people learn to become intolerant, to become polarized. It's in the university, and you have to remember that these days, most young people go to university, they get influenced by this kind of stuff. And if I take, for example, sort of Georgetown University, where I think Jason teaches, I think it's a very good example. I mean, just very recently, I read about a couple of professors being fired for making off-the-cuff comments, totally unproblematic comments, just because they didn't have their mute button on. You know, I read there's a law professor called Louis Michael Seidman, and he basically makes the point that he's changed his mind about freedom of speech. He used to be for the First Amendment, but now he realizes that free speech is a very real problem. And if you look at what a lot of law faculty people in America and England are saying, they're basically saying, I believe in free speech, but. And what comes after the but, that's really, really quite important, because what they're saying is that free speech is, to all intents and purposes, a second-order principle. It's something that, you know, is okay for me, but not for all these other guys. So it seems to me that the real problem for me is that when you have a cultural elite that kind of exudes intolerance and promotes this irrational politics of the person, it's not surprising that the rest of society buys into that, and the rest of society becomes influenced by it. And it seems to me that the problem is not social media, but the fact that we have this kind of cultural terrain. And that's really what we need to begin to tackle somehow, because the way things are going at the moment is in a sense, is almost as if the very foundation of liberty, in the way that we understand it, has become negotiable in our culture. And that's something that to me is much more scary than the Twitter mob or the individuals who are really kind of trying to shut us up on Twitter or on Instagram or on any other social media. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure that really professors and intellectuals are people who really love liberty or freedom. I mean, anyone who lives, at least here in Brazil at university, knows that the idea that intellectuals are always involved with freedom, maybe it's a fairy tale or a folk theory. Because even if we think of the French intellectuals right after the war, I mean the Second World War, studied by Tony Judt, the English historian, he showed that many people, they were for Soviet Union, even though all the crimes were shown already. But I would like to go to something else. When I mentioned the marketing thing, I think that much of this kind of censorship, it's a kind of business. I mean, if I can put someone out of the university, it means that I have more space, or my group have more space. Or if I make someone to be canceled in social media, maybe the sponsors will move away. I'll give an example. We might have many examples. I'm sure that in America or in Britain, you have a lot of examples. But here in Brazil, think of maybe you were a journalist, okay? You were a journalist, you work for media on TV, radio, or even newspapers. You write on newspapers. And then you say something. And then a lot of people in social media comes against you. And they start like when we talk about those sleeping giants people, okay? They come and they start a pressure on, imagine that you work for a newspaper, we may call it X, doesn't matter the name. And then people like sleeping giants start to put pressure on the newspaper to fire you. So the great business that put money on this newspaper, maybe they don't want to be associated to a name, to the name of this journalist. Even though if you think that this business, this company, it's really involved in public debate. But when it comes to business, it will go to the newspaper and say, if Mr. Somebody is working here and writing here, I'm not going to put money on your newspaper anymore. It happens all the time. It happens in Brazil. That's why I started saying that I think there is a business component, a marketing component that is part of this problem. It's money. Get down to business.
Pondé, Jason, and Frank, thank you very much for your presence today and all your contribution for this debate.